Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. As he's introduced me while I was dealing with technology, my name is Jacob. I do work for a company that has a bird on its logo, thinks canary, and today we'll be discussing the back and forth between phishing technologies and the development of defenses. So I know that it is the end of the day. It is a Friday and one of the last talks of the day. I know there are beverages, families, and weekend DIY projects that you're probably all looking forward to, so I do appreciate your time. I did actually remember it is Halloween, and I tried to find a sufficiently Halloween-themed movie poster to kind of depict it being one of the last people. So I had in my mind a cabin with a serial killer who was slowly copying people off. Unfortunately, it's only the last one standing, and I'm not the last one, so you're going to have to make do with second to last with love. So I do appreciate you. Now that we've gotten that out of the way, what do you think of when I say phishing? I know before I started getting into this, I thought relatively boring, like something that I remember from a kid, and like I wouldn't fall for that. Now I think some people who have big organizations, they may think scary, but what I would like for you guys to see as the course of this talk goes is think about maybe dynamic. And hopefully this talk will help you see how this is actively a very contested area where people who are developing phishing technologies and toolkits are in like active cat and mouse with the defenders. And it's not just something that happened a long, long time ago. Now, if you are going to slip off the back or be lulled to sleep by my calming voice, as it is a Friday afternoon, write down these 3 words, and then on Monday morning when you go back to work and your boss says, how was the conference, what did you learn, what are you going to do, then you can pull this out and say device-bound passkeys. What are those? I'm going to look it up and I'm going to enable those because this is basically the only silver bullet you're going to find for phishing. And as you'll see, there's a lot of workarounds, including the work that I'm going to be presenting, but really this is the way you need to go. And so if you want something to do on Monday, this is what you should be doing. So, like all great talks, there is a beginning, and then we're going to progress to the middle, and then, sadly, there will be the end. So, let's start a long time ago. Sadly, I was still around, and I remember all of these things like the 90s and the baggy pants, the Jinko jeans, which are now oddly in again, and I think they look terrible still. But maybe that's just the repressed sadness that my parents would never buy me those cool baggy jeans, and I could never be a skateboarder. And now that I see all these people wearing them again, I'm like, no. Don't like that. So phishing has actually been around for a very long time. Early on, it was like, here's this attachment, double click on it, trust me, which we've seen still works actually in Alex's talk. You know, if you just host a GitHub that says malware, try it. And so the one that I remember very specifically because I saw it, and it was the love bug, and you click on it and it had little fireworks and said I love you and a little letter. I actually forwarded that on to someone from my Hotmail or my MSN account back then when I was in elementary school. That was kind of a long time ago. It was very much, here's some malware, go run it. I'm going to do something that may or may not be super bad. There was a little bit of like the early predecessor to PayPal was something called eGold. Does anyone remember eGold? There's like one person. Okay, perfect. There's one of us that is in this generation that remembers eGold. So I guess after 9/11, which was in 2001, well, there's one every year, but the one that I'm talking about happened in 2011. That one, they did this ID verification after, and that was the first kind of credential harvesting phishing that happened at a big scale. So it said, go to this website, please go and enter your credentials for your eGold account, and we'll make sure that you're who you say you are. And I think that partly is because there was really bad endpoint protection way back then, and it was kind of complicated to set up a server back when you needed to like know someone at an ISP and have a phone and need to know what dialing was or have a lot of money for a T1 line or something like that. And so it's kind of wild that, like 10, 15 years ago, 99-point-something% of all phishing sites had no SSL because people were like, that's really expensive. They're going to ask me my name. I'm not going to go do that. And it's very much changed these days. And so those sites that were stealing your credentials were very much a, here's this static wget mirror, click on it, see what happens, and you get owned. The one that I do remember in high school was RSA getting compromised. That was an interesting one because it was the first time I've ever heard the word spear phishing, where they like found this guy and they're like, he's the one that I want to get to run malware. I'm going to send him something that tells him about like his, hiring information or his bonus or his salary, and he clicked on it and clicked enable macros, and then that pivoted to them like attacking Lockheed Martin. And so that was the first time. So again, that's still pretty old. Like, as we saw with one of the previous speakers, there were probably people here that were still in high school or like not even around back then, actually. So now we're back into the modern era. It's like this item or it-be. So there's browser in the browser, there's browser in the middle, and adversary in the middle. And these are kind of the common phishing kits that you see. And they're all super DevOps-y, and I will go into a little bit later. But they're kind of, these are the terms you may see. I would say that adversary in the middle is the one I'm going to focus on because it's the most prevalent. But just to give you guys a little context, this is a screenshot of someone going and doing like a social login on Microsoft. It's impossible to see, but if you actually look at that bar, it does say like login.microsoft. If you were to go and click on the certificate information, it would be all good. The thing is that that window is actually not a window in your browser. It's just JavaScript and CSS making it look like a browser. They are theming it based on the information, like, oh, are you running dark mode or night mode, and what's your browser or your OS? And they're simply just using crazy front end to make it look like you've popped this window up and now you're going to enter your Gmail or your credentials. That is really tricky. Like I can make like document.write JavaScript level. I cannot make a browser window up here. So the next one is like, okay, that's clever, but pretty tricky. Why don't we just host a browser on the cloud and then use something like NoVNC or Guacamole to stream that to the user? And so this right here, again, you can't really see it, doesn't really matter, but basically that's the Microsoft login page that I am browsing to in my browser that is a full screen kiosk mode browser browsing to it. So if I had thought about it, I would have done one of those yo dog memes. Hey, you like your browser, so I put a browser in your browser so you can browse while you browse. This one is pretty clever because it looks to the targeted site to be a real client because it is a real client running Chrome. It's on a real system. And they do these like kind of JS and like iframe breaking techniques to see if you're being run in an iframe. And this is just a legit browser, just happens to be the password cache, and there's a keylogger running on that machine. You just don't know it, right? So this one is pretty cool, but it's very expensive in the sense that if you're trying to phish like a lot of people, you need to be hosting a lot of infrastructure. And we're past the T1 days, but it's still fairly expensive to do that. And so this is the one that's kind of been like the sky is falling, adversary in the middle. Basically, this is like a proxy that's put in front of the target site, and it just proxies all of the traffic from the victim to the target site, and it sits in the middle, and when that session ID goes through, it just harvests it. This is like, I would say a vast majority, so I'm going to say 80% or so is adversary in the middle because it works really well, it's very lightweight, and you just have a couple simple rewrite rules. So if you see login.microsoft and you're hosting it from login.fake, you just rewrite that with a simple regex, and now when someone goes to that site, they're browsing, whatever site, and you're able to stream their sessions out and then copy them off. These ones work really well if you have most types of MFA as well, because you're just connecting via a proxy server. And so, phishing for a long, long time, I thought was kind of like, passé, old things that I remember from high school. Now it's becoming a big thing. It's the initial Actus vector of the year for every year. And like credential harvesting is like 80% of all of this phishing. And so it's moved from malware dissemination to credential harvesting. Obviously, we're also consolidating our credentials. We want to have one login that gets us into everything. So those IDPs that are controlling all of that, the Oktas, the Microsoft Entra ID, the Google Workspaces, those are becoming the big targets. And so now, rather than having to host a phishing site for every little podunk site, you just host one for Microsoft, and then you get access to all of that. It is the #1 initial entry vector for modern breaches, and phishing kits have become incredibly easy to deploy and manage. It's like download a Docker script, run it. They have a management suite that will send your emails, build customized lures. They have all this self-defense, like they host their own DNS server, and if they start seeing DNS lookups that are outside of when they've sent the lure, they just enter like some junk. They also make a default username. If you just go to the domain, it will return like a very vanilla site or redirect you somewhere else, because as soon as you register a SSL certificate, it's going to go to the certificate transparency log, and the Googles and the Microsofts and all the phishing catchers will go and check to see if that looks like PayPal.com. And so they only look bad when you are a like known victim. And so we also learned earlier yesterday that the 90 or 80% is actually just a vibe. So it's vibe percent of all of our credential phishing now. So you may be asking, okay, well, we have two-factor auth, we're all set, right? And unfortunately, if you look, like 2/3 of the types of phishing, of malware, of MFA is not phishing resistant. And so unfortunately, SMS is bad for a lot of reasons. There's also like all the weird old legacy phone network issues. The like hardware tokens that RSA builds and like the ones on your phone where it changes the number, those are pretty phishable, especially with adversary or browser in the middle. The push code one, also, you see this thing, they're just proxying that through. And there's also the push bomb where you just keep sending it and you just hope that either they get frustrated and click OK, or they hit it by accident because it just keeps popping up over and over and over again. Now you'll notice that there's passkeys, which I talked about at the very beginning, if you can remember, 12 minutes ago. That one is a good one because it does defeat browser in the middle and adversary in the middle, because it does cryptographic signing to the domain that is talking to. And so if you're hosting it on a fake website, it's going to give you a cryptographic signature for that website, but that's not going to be useful for Microsoft or Google. Same with PKI, but PKI is really hard to deploy and no one ever does it. So as I mentioned, adversary in the middle is eating phishing. It's the leading phishing type. It's super easy to deploy. Out of the box, it basically defeats most of the MFAs that people are pushing. Like sadly, if you create a new Azure tenant for a long, long time, they were just pushing you to use their Authenticator app, which was very phishable. And to step back, and we've seen this before in some of the other talks about kind of the shared responsibility model. That one on the left that's highlighted, it's the identity and access management. And that is a seam where it's kind of partially customer responsible and partially vendor responsible. And that seam is where attackers love to be, because there's a little bit of the whole finger pointing either way, right? So if you have a Microsoft tenant, you can create conditional access rules that say what you want to see, but you're not seeing the raw telemetry that Microsoft is seeing. And Microsoft isn't knowing your intentions other than these rather coarse-grained access policies. And so that is these really difficult points where attackers can slip in. So who here has heard of Things? Just out of, okay, cool. So you know that this is way out of our wheelhouse, like we don't do phishing. Oddly enough, the company that Haroon started was Fish5, which was phishing emulation like a long, long time ago, but that's completely irrelevant. So one of our first canary tokens, who here has heard of a canary token? Cool. Who's ever used them? Yeah. One of the first ones that still is really popular is the clone site token. And basically that's a little snippet of JavaScript you put on your website. It checks to see if the address in the location bar matches what you expect it to be, like paypal.com. If not, it fires the token. You get an alert, hey, someone's rehosting this site and they're very lazy. And so that works actually really well. Like people catch this stuff all the time, which I think means that a lot of attackers are really lazy. But most of the sites where this has this shared responsibility don't have the programmability. You can't just give Google some JavaScript and say, hey, host this JavaScript that I wrote on your domain, on your login page for Google Workspace. You can't go to Microsoft and say, hey, here's this thing. I want you to run all authentication through my server and my code. And so Microsoft Entra ID is a really popular target, and they don't let you run any JavaScript, and so you're kind of flying blind. You have no visibility because you've outsourced that to Microsoft. You only get visibility after an authentication attempt has been mostly succeeded. Oddly, their logs are really delayed, so you don't know it until after like 5 to 15 to 3 hours after that's happened because their logs are really slow. When it works, when they're not having a non-regional outage like they were yesterday. So I'm not going to belabor what our token is, but basically we found that you can insert custom JavaScript, or sorry, custom CSS into your Entra login, and there's a lot of other like login pages where you can kind of theme it to make it look like green, for example. And with that CSS, we have a little bit of invisible CSS you can upload to that and add it to your company branding. Doesn't look any different to the user, but when the user's browser downloads that, they're downloading that from Microsoft Entra's CDN. It has a little snippet saying, "Ho, go load this image from this site." And that site is actually hosted at AWS, which I find somewhat ironic that we're protecting a lot of Azure logins using AWS. And because that is coming from that site where you downloaded it, it's going to include the referrer. So the browser is going to say, "Hey, I'm coming from login.fake.com. They sent me over here to get this image. Where's the image?" And our little CloudFront function, which if you've not heard of, lets you run tiny little functions that like run everywhere and they're really cheap. And if it sees that the referrer is not coming from login.microsoft online or a few of the official Microsoft Windows sites, it says, "Oh yes, the image is over at canarytokens.org, go check it out." And the browser says, "Sure, let me go grab it." It grabs it, triggers the alert. We get the information about the client before they've even typed their password in, and we've been able to cause an alert. So this is what happens when it's great. It goes there, it says, "Here's your 1x1 image GIF." Sounds good, perfect. And then if we have a proxy in the middle, that's going to capture that, but it's still going to have the wrong referrer. It's going to go to us, we're going to pass it off to Canary Tokens, it's going to go to the Canary Token server, and it's going to alert. And that looks like something on the right. You get an email, you get a webhook, whatnot. And so we released this early last year, just with like a little blog post, and thought, oh, this would be something kind of neat. And kind of moved on to the next thing a little bit. And then I went and looked at our AWS dashboard and our bill, and I was like, wow, we're protecting 200 logins every single second of every single hour of every single day. So in the time it took me to do that, we've had like 1,000 logins we've checked, which is pretty cool because also AWS costing on that means that it costs us roughly $400 a month to protect millions and millions and millions of logins, which is kind of cool. We're only looking at the free open source Canary Tokens token, but we catch unique phishing attacks probably on the order of like a dozen or so every couple days. And of those, 5%, not 75%, 5% of those, the SSL certificate was registered the same day we caught them. So in a 5% number of times, I suspect it's people testing to make sure their phishing site worked, and then they're actually alerting the owner that they're being phished before they even get phished. And it's free and easy to store. So basically, like, I think it's great, happy days, we can just retire, I'm done, I can move on to the next thing. Unfortunately, our adversaries are not static. They're not, they're not just a distribution that you can draw a curve over and then they're done. And so, Evil Jinx, if you've heard of it, who's any heard of Evil Jinx? Cool. There's at least some people who are awake and have heard of Evil Jinx. It's a very popular phish kit. It's open source. It's very easy to deploy. It does all the stuff of like generating lures, sending all that stuff, doing all the DNS, hiding from the good guys, those types of things. And Evil Jinx is probably what we see the most, and you can tell by a couple reasons. There's like some bugs in it that we see that they haven't updated, and also like there's some little like default configurations that make it pretty clear that that's what it is. So earlier this year, they released the Pro version, which basically fixes our little trick of referring. And so what they do is they set an override refer policy telling the client's browser, you're paranoid now, don't tell anyone where you came from. And sadly, that coincided with a Chrome bug where Chrome would actually ignore the refer policy and leak your private information anyways, which had been there for conveniently like 2 years, and then they decided to fix it just as Evil Jinx Pro came out, unfortunately. But it used to be that, yeah, basically now, and so now they'll tell your browser, don't leak the refer, and we see nothing, and so we don't alert on that. We just say, well, it's not useful information. So between those two things happening over the winter, unfortunately now, like, this is starting to be less valuable. And also, the guy who built Evil Jinx, which you can't see, which is fine, is like tweeting like, hey, don't get caught by a canary token. Here's the domain they use for CloudFront. Just block CloudFront. Here's a little script. You know, like, basically totally for red teamers. Here's some stuff I'm going to post on Twitter that lets you bypass this detection. So we think, okay, well, we're done then. What a bummer. We have had some small wins. So actually, we can detect browser in the middle phishing because only crazy people browse in full kiosk mode. And so if someone hits the login page in full kiosk mode, there's a different CSS rule set that's activated, so we can catch that. And then also just another cute one, which was, again, it's going to be like only a couple months probably before this gets fixed. But you'll notice if you generate a canary token now, there's no CloudFront domain in the CSS. It's just got like random / characters and stuff, because CSS will normalize Unicode code points if they're in hex before it treats it like a URL and a string. But the regex that Evil Jinx uses doesn't, and so it actually has no string for CloudFront in there. So if you deploy one of these now and the attacker has deployed that, we've actually implemented a slight parser differential exploit so that Evil Jinx will still say there's no CloudFront here, and the trigger will still alert. So now we're happy again. Unfortunately, Keanu Neese presented at DEF CON 33 I just moved here after DEF CON, so it was summer, but now it's winter. He presented a way to use the Microsoft login page to host your own phishing infrastructure. So you can keep people entirely on the legitimate domain and phish them even with MFA, which is really cool and really scary. I have a little bit of confidence in the fact that it's a very targeted attack, and if you want to see some really cool stuff, you should go watch this talk because it is very, very clever. So basically, you buy a domain that's close to your target. So if your target is thinks.com, you get one that's like one letter off, like think-t.com. And then you set up an Entra ID, you verify that you own that domain, which you do, that's great. You set it up to use on-prem Active Directory, and then you install info-stealing malware on that Active Directory server, which is dumping credentials that are being sent to it. Then, Entra ID, part of the company branding, is you can create a custom font. And so you take a font and you change the letter that you're off from the target to make it look like that one, and then you upload that as your custom font. And then the lure or the link is login.microsoft, and you add the login hint, which will be base64 or like URL encoded, and so it'll say Jacob at lots of random percents and stuff that no one looks at anyways. In there is the hyphen version, and then login says, oh, you're trying to go to this tenant. We have a verified domain, and it says Jacob at thinks.com. Is this loaded the custom font? And now I log in saying that's me, perfect. And I look, it's login.microsoft.com. It's signed. I'm not being browser tricked by some weird JavaScript thing. And then you log in, and you've actually sent your username and password off to them. And then you redirect them to another tenant, which serves with a company branding dynamic generated images for the MFA push to also defeat that while keeping them on login.microsoft.com. So it's a pretty cool attack. I don't think we're going to see the lazy attackers doing it very often, but it is pretty cool, and I would recommend you go watch that talk. It's online. So we started out after the weird rom-com thing with a slight back step in history, back to the 90s, and now we're going to like jump forward. So just to put this in perspective, so this is the last like roughly 2 years. So we released the token last year, and then Evil Jinx Pro came out that defeats our token, and then Chrome, I kind of colored this one both red and blue because technically it's like a privacy win, but it's kind of a bummer for us. And that was like the next month, and then we have our CSS encoding the next month, and then the fish from Entra came out. And so that's just going to show, again, to hit home, that all of this stuff is happening like on a month-to-month basis. Like we are like, you know, shooting back and forth in this game of cat and mouse, trying to catch people. So, in conclusion, like basically no user awareness training, sorry, or any single detection will defeat any of these things, especially a dedicated attacker, except for a cryptographic method like passkeys. So it's time to move to a phishing-resistant MFA now. I know it's going to be painful, but I know lots of large organizations that have stopped using our token because they've been able to roll that out and mandate it. So it is possible, even if you're a legacy enterprise, blah, 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 it is possible. That said, there's a super clear lag between what a red teamer writes up and presents at DEF CON and what we see in the wild. Like, we're still catching people running Evil Jinx 2, which is now 3 versions old, with the bug that they never built, like rebuilt and fixed today, right? And so that's still happening. And a lot of time you see this low effort where they just get a complete nonsense domain. It's not even close. It's just like random cat typing across the thing. They get a domain, they spin up Evil Jinx, they mass spam it, see if someone does it. If not, they get a new domain and just do it over and over and over again. And because now Evil Jinx is a very expensive pro software, and Evil Jinx 2 still leaks the refer, you're going to see a very long tail of people getting caught with this detection. So we still think it's worthwhile, our token, and so if you have an Azure tenant, check it out. You could deploy it like free open source. But we do think that over time that value will decrease as people start moving towards new things. And then I did also just want to hit on that last little bit about that seam in the responsibility model between customer and vendor responsibility. I think it's a cost that's often overlooked or not included when you're saying, okay, how much is this going to cost us to host it versus how much it's going to cost us to outsource. There's a visibility cost that's really hard to put a number on. And when you're outsourcing like the detection team, you have no idea how many people are trying to log into usernames that don't exist in your Microsoft or Google tenant. If they're trying to get into you because you don't have that, only once it's a valid username do you start getting a little bit of information. And so for us, we think that that's something that you want to consider when you are moving some of your stuff to the cloud, to some whatever as a service. How are you going to be able to see that? And you're also outsourcing some of the things and making detection engineering a lot harder. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your time. The Canary tokens is canarytokens.org. I also want to make a shameless plug while I have a microphone. We do this thing called Thinkscapes, where we review like all security talks that happen every quarter, and we pick like 20 or so that we think are underplayed or like really awesome. And then we write about them and we give it out for free. And it's a lot of work, but I think it's super valuable because so many talks are given and like people are like, that was cool, and then they never know it or it wasn't recorded or whatnot. And so do check that out. Again, it is free. And of course, I am just one person standing on the shoulders of all these other people who are doing a lot of work in this area. And so with that, thank you very much.
I am a super genius.